Are you applying to UX roles but struggle to get a callback? Do you feel like your amazing portfolio is just getting overlooked? There might be a few subtle mistakes costing you interviews.
It's okay for you to leave now.
All right. I've reviewed thousands of portfolios in my career, and in this video, I'll give you a sneak peek at the framework that I use for reviewing portfolios, as well as a breakdown of some of the mistakes I see most often. And stick around to the end, I'll review a simple tip for showcasing your work that many designers overlook. It'll be controversial, but I promise it'll get you more interviews. Hey friends, I'm Chris Abad. I have more than 20 years of experience in UX design. I've worked with some of the best design teams in the world at companies like Dropbox and Google. I've even started 3 companies of my own. On this channel, I'll share some of the tough lessons I've learned about what it takes to succeed in this industry. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just kicking off your career, this channel offers insights you won't find anywhere else. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing. The first thing I want to do is let you in on a little secret you may not be aware of. As a hiring manager, if I'm sitting down to review portfolios, I might be looking at 10 or 20 at any given time. The reality is I'm probably spending 30 to 60 seconds at most looking at your portfolio to figure out if I'm going to move you to the next stage. That means that you've got a pretty limited window to show off your work and set you apart from the rest of the competition. In those 30 to 60 seconds, I'm trying to answer a few specific questions to figure out if I'm going to move you to the next stage or not. So let's do this. I'm going to share a simple framework for how I think about reviewing portfolios, and we'll use this to cover some of the common mistakes that I find when I look at portfolios. There's really 3 main questions that I'm trying to answer. The first one is, do you get it? The second one is, are you high enough caliber? And the third one is, are you a good fit for this particular role? And so what we can do is we can break this into a framework that we can use to talk through some of the common mistakes that might be getting in your way at each stage. Now, I've looked at so many portfolios that I can really tell whether or not you get it in the first 10 seconds or less. And when I say do you get it, I mean, do you understand what a portfolio should look like? Getting through this phase cuts out maybe 30% of the portfolios that are submitted. The reality is, in a lot of roles, I may not even see portfolios at this stage. It might be a recruiter or someone else who's reviewing portfolios for me. Also, if you're watching this, most likely you don't fall into this category. You get it. You know what a portfolio is. However, there might be a few small mistakes that you're making that accidentally put you into this bucket. The first problem that I run across here is your portfolio has technical bugs. And when I say technical bugs, more often than not, these are typos in your code or some weird combination of CSS and the particular browser that I'm viewing your portfolio in. But in the end, what this ends up looking like is a layout that is completely off. I get it. A lot of designers want to use the portfolio itself as its own showpiece to show off your skills. The thing is the more creative and complex that you get with the design of your portfolio, the more complex designs require exponentially more skill to execute right. And that's skill across the board, from visual design to information architecture to technical skill. If you pull off all these things right, it might earn you a few extra points in the end, especially if those aren't skills that are important for the particular role that you're applying for. But the thing is if you get it wrong, you can completely kill your chances of getting a call back. If you aren't completely competent in all of those skills, just use templates. There's so many good ones out there, and there's nothing wrong with using a well-designed template to showcase your work, because at the end of the day, as a hiring manager, what I really care about is your work. In my personal opinion, if you're using a template to showcase your portfolio, it's not hurting your chances at all as long as the quality of work is there. The second simple mistake that I see so many people make is overusing animation. Animation, when I'm first looking at a portfolio, having subtle animations to create visual interest can be really helpful. But this is, like many things, an example of where less is more. If you're going to use animation, use it tastefully. The best animation is also contextual to the work. It's another situation where if you do it well, it'll definitely help you stand out. But if you get it wrong, it becomes completely distracting, and it's so difficult for me to look past the movement and the flashing and everything happening on the page to actually look at the quality of the content. I think the best way to use animation in your portfolio is in the context of your work. If your work required animation, like maybe you built some animated prototypes or other like visual graphics, I think the best way to use animation is in a way that's contextual. And so if the work that you did required animation, let's say you built an animated prototype, great. Have that show up in your portfolio to show that you did that type of work. It's also possible to use animation in a way that enhances but isn't directly related to the work that you did. Just be sure that the way that you do it is subtle and tasteful. The third mistake I'll come across that's really obvious is your portfolio is all show and no tell. Don't get me wrong, the visuals in your case study are super important. However, if you don't have a clear narrative for each project explaining the problem and your design process and the impact that your solutions had, it's not a real case study. And really, this type of narrative is just table stakes. Not only do you want to tell a narrative that helps connect the dots between your visuals, but ideally you're doing it in a way that really tells the story of your work and your personality and how you approach things. It should be clear that the work that you do is unique to you to the point where this story would feel out of place in any other designer's portfolio. I came across a good example of this recently. I found a designer, his name's Joel Khalifa, and in his case study, he not only brought his own voice to his writing, but he also used small visual touches throughout his case study to really make his case study come alive. Let's take a look. I really like the way that Joel uses a combination of narrative and visual elements to tell an engaging story. At the top, he has pictures of the team, which really helps humanize the people who worked on this. And then also he includes chat bubbles throughout his case study, which I think is really interesting and gives me an idea of how other people either on the team or elsewhere in the company reacted to his work and how they were impacted. So we talked about how in the first 10 seconds or less, I'm trying to answer the question, do you get it? The next step is for me to figure out, are you high enough caliber? And this really takes you from being in the top 70% of applicants to something closer to the top 10%. And so at this stage, let's talk about some of the common mistakes that I ran into that keep you from falling into this category. The first mistake I typically see here is you walk through, in your case study, you walk through the steps and your process, but you're really missing articulating the why. What's really important is that you explain not only the decisions that you made, but the rationale behind your decisions. And this really helps me as the hiring manager understand what your thought process is and your critical thinking skills. I came across a really good example of this looking at another designer's portfolio, Simon Pan. Simon Pan's a designer who works at Uber. And in this case study, I thought he did an amazing job of using his headlines to tee up the why behind each activity that he did throughout the process. And this is not something that I see in a lot of case studies, but even in the headline here, what a lot of people will do is they'll just promote the Uber app. They'll talk about what the core value proposition of the app as a whole is. But what Simon does very concisely is he talks about what the challenge was. And the goal here for this particular case study is perfecting the pickup. And if you go through and just do a quick scan of the headlines that Simon uses, they do a great job of contextualizing and helping people understand what it is that he's doing. Here, Simon says that the challenge that his team had was to recapture the magic in 10 months. The first step was about picking up the pieces. During the discovery process, what they found was writer expectations changed over time. That's an excellent insight that he's putting right into his title. And even here in his subtitle, he says most pickups require additional physical or coordination effort. So I think Simon has great hierarchy here in his information. He's doing an excellent job here guiding you through the process through using not only headlines, but also callouts like this. In a city as busy as San Francisco, over $1 million was wasted per week because of problematic pickups. This is great. This is amazing. This actually leads me to the second common mistake that I run into. It's that you're over-focused on the process rather than what you learned. A design process is not just about building something from beginning to end. It's really a process of uncovering new learnings and applying those learnings to improve your output. And any designer who's been in this industry for a while knows that these projects never go according to plan. And if you've done the work right, along the way, you will learn surprising things that will change what you believe the right answer is. And so being able to uncover those insights and learn from them and apply them, it's a really critical part of what things will look like on the job. And so you need to be able to show that off in your case studies as well. A good example of this that I came across was from a designer named Carolus Kosis. And I apologize if I butchered your name. Carolus is a designer at OpenAI and was previously at Stripe. This is a case study about a project for Cujo. And the thing I really liked about this was the way that Carolus was able to highlight what he learned throughout the process. And so again, you can see this called out very clearly in the headlines, but an insight here is that for an ordinary person, anything related to cybersecurity seems abstract and cryptic. And then here in this headline, he mentions that protecting children from the bad stuff is increasingly important for families whose kids are taking their first steps online. And then says that the team designed a simple yet powerful UI for content control, scheduling, and profiles. So the nice thing here is Carolus was able to very quickly make a connection between the insights that they learned through their research and the decisions that they made in what they designed and the functionality that the app had. Here's another section of this case study that I really appreciate. While engaging with our community, we were surprised to see how excited they were to report new threats. This is a great example of what I mentioned before, where I said, as you go through a proper design process, you're going to learn things that you didn't expect. Being able to call out where those surprises happen in your process and then showing how you react to them is a really important part of demonstrating how you're likely to perform on the job. Okay, so we talked about some of the simple mistakes that might keep you from falling into the top 10% of candidates. So once I've been able to answer the question, are you high caliber? The next question I want to answer for myself is, are you a good fit for this particular role? And this is what will really separate the top 10% of applicants from the top 1 to 5% of candidates. And so here's a few common mistakes that I run into here. The first mistake I see a lot of candidates making is you bury your strengths. The thing is, not all designers are created equal. You're going to have certain strengths and certain weaknesses across the entire process. But so many case studies follow the same formula for the same design process from beginning to end in a chronological form. But let's say your strengths are actually later in that process versus earlier in that process. By showing your weaknesses first and your strengths second, you're only hurting yourself. For example, let's say UI design is one of your strengths. If you're showing a bunch of personas that are shallow and unresearched, you're really doing more damage than good. A great example that I came across to illustrate this point was a portfolio from Katie McCurdy's. Now, Katie's strengths are in research and strategy. In fact, the way that she describes her role on this project is human-centered designer with a special focus on research and synthesis. I actually love the way that Katie's been able to call out what her specific strengths are very clearly and at the very top of her case study. But not only that, but if you look through Katie's case study, it doesn't read like your typical case study where it has all of the steps of the process from beginning to end all given equal weight. It's very clear that not only is research and synthesis Katie's strength, but she's organized her entire case study in a way that helps show off where she shines best. And so as I'm going through this, I can see that she calls out her challenge, but her process is really about doing in-person customer interviews as she goes through the hospital. She does interviews with frontline staffs, and she even runs creative workshops with employees at the hospital. She shows some really basic, pretty much paper prototypes of the wayfinding that they put into the hospital. And she also showed feedback that people had on the sites. There's even a portion in here where Katie talks about changing the paint color of an accent wall to give it more contrast. And so the thing is, this project could have been presented in a totally different way. She could have talked about the production process of creating the signs and painting the wall. She could have talked about different color choices that they explored for the accent wall. And I'm sure all these things happened as part of the project. But what Katie did was she touched on those parts to show a complete process, but she really made the research and synthesis and the way that that research drove the strategy of this project the highlight of the show. This is a great job, Katie. Really well done. The other mistake that I see designers run into in their portfolios at this stage is their case studies aren't quite as relevant as they could be. The thing is, if you're doing this really well, you're matching very specifically the type of designer and the particular skills and strengths that a role is looking for with what you are marketing as your area of expertise. And that area of expertise lines up very clearly with the case studies that you've decided to show in your portfolio. Now, I know this can be really difficult for new grads who maybe don't have a lot of case studies to show in their portfolio. But as you develop more and more, you really only need 3 to 5 in your portfolio. And so pick the ones that are most relevant for the role that you're applying for. This is particularly important for applicants who have a variety of talents. If you're going to apply to different positions, create different versions of your portfolio, use them for each type of role that you're applying to. For example, you might have one portfolio that's really targeted at UX and UI work. You might have another one that's more focused on your graphic design skills. And you might even have a third portfolio that's more focused on illustration. The point is here, be specific and tailored towards what you're going after. It's for many years, it's been common knowledge that you should tailor your resumes very specifically to the role that you're applying for. Very rarely do I see designers doing this for their portfolio. And the reality is your portfolio as a designer is far more important than your resume. As a hiring manager, in almost every single scenario, I'm looking at your portfolio long before I look at your resume. If I look at your resume at all. If I am looking at your resume, I'm spending 5 times longer on your LinkedIn than I am your resume. Now I want to share a simple tip on how you showcase your work that I see a lot of designers overlooking. And you'll probably find this controversial, but I promise this will get you more interviews. Remember back when I said I'm really only spending 30 to 60 seconds looking at your portfolio? This feels unfair. We've spent all this time making sure that the right content is in your portfolio. It's filled with words. You're telling a story. You're providing context. You're giving examples of insights. But the thing is, people, and especially designers, are incredibly visual people. And so the best thing that you can do for your portfolio to get you more interviews is really use a lot of images and UI. Now, I know what you're going to say. I'm applying for a UX role, not necessarily a role focused on visual design. Why does that make sense? Now, unfortunately, this is where we get into a little cognitive bias as part of the hiring process. And I'm not saying this is a good thing, but the fact is it's happening. And if you want to increase your chances at getting interviews, you'll take advantage of it as best you can. When people see amazing UI, they immediately assume that as a designer, you're also good at UX. It's not always the case. I've worked with plenty of really talented UI designers that are horrible at UX and vice versa. Unfortunately, the reality of the job market today is really great UI design will get you interviews. It's your UX chops, like your strategic thinking and your user-centered approach, that's going to get you the job, but the UI design is what'll get your foot in the door. And it's okay if you only want to focus on UX. You don't have to force yourself to be a UI designer if you really don't want to, but if you want to make it as easy as possible to get those interviews, this is what I've seen works best. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I suck at UI. Or maybe you just feel like you're not the artistic type. The thing is, good UI is more objective than you might think. There's rules and logic to it, and all of those things can be learned. And so if you'd like to learn more about how anyone can produce good, aesthetically pleasing UI, be sure to subscribe, and I'll cover this in an upcoming video. See you then.